Okay, welcome to the first video of this on this channel. Good start. Today we're going to discuss the argument and what an argument consists of in the most basic sense, how to deconstruct one, and how to approach an argumentative text and deconstruct that to see its various arguments, premises, constituents, and so on. If you're an outside viewer, so to speak, who doesn't know who I am, I'm just a teacher from Stockholm, Sweden, specializing in English and Swedish as a second language, and I simply decided to start recording some of the things that I teach in the classroom, where I am able to expand on it a bit more, given that I have unlimited time in a video, as opposed to the limited time I have in a classroom. So if you're an outside viewer, welcome. Enjoy. If you are a student of mine, welcome, enjoy. And if there are any questions on the material that I present here, look me up, send me an email, and we will work it out. And hopefully this helps you out a little bit. So, I have a PowerPoint that I'm going to use in part. We're not going to go through the whole thing, but just the first couple of slides are still useful for this video. First and foremost as well, what we're going to do today in order is to first just look at the definition of an argument and what that actually is. Then we're going to look at a few examples and then read a full text and deconstruct it from in a very simple manner to find its arguments, premises, conclusions, and so on. Just to give you an idea of how that can be done. So let's begin by just looking at the argument itself and what that actually is. So when you define an argument, you are left with essentially three main categories of definitions. The general definition is a reason or set of reasons given in support of an idea, action, or theory. If you then move on to logic, you'd get the definition that argument in logic, reasons that support a conclusion, sometimes formulated so that the conclusion is deduced from the premises. And then finally you have prepositional logic, which states that an argument proceeds from a set of premises to a conclusion by means of logical implication via a procedure called logical inference. We're mainly going to look at the general definition, because if you want to look at it from the logic or prepositional logic perspective, you have to do quite a bit of digging and learning about the various terms associated with prepositional logic. Also, sorry if I sound stuffed. I still have some COVID symptoms lingering around, so my voice might not be the very best. Apologies for that. In terms of prepositional logic and just argument terminology, you could look at things and ideas such as deductive, inductive, valid, invalid, strong, weak, sound, unsound, cogent, and uncogent arguments. But again, that takes quite a bit of education to discuss, and I would have to go into a whole lecture series on it. But just to let you know that it is possible. And then once you've done that, you can start to look at things like this, which is part of the prepositional logic. It's super interesting. So if you think that this looks interesting, then just YouTube some prepositional logic videos and get to self-learning, so to speak, because it's a lot of fun to do. And then you also have the semantic properties of argumentation, which looks like this. That's the one thing I actually didn't do at university. I opted for construction grammar instead. But anyway, that's what it can look like. But like I said, we are going to look at this from a more generalized perspective, following the first definition that we looked at. And we are going to look at four main constituents, also known as just parts of an argument. They are as follows. central or initial claim, and you can think of this as a thesis statement of the argument, kind of. Secondly, you have something called premise, which is also known as reasons, and they are quite simply the reasons and premises for or of the argument. Think of the initial claim as the answer to the question what, while the reason or the premises answer the question why. Thirdly, we have evidence that you can use to substantiate your claims and reasons and premises even further, because simply stating things without having secondary or primary or tertiary sources and so on is not going to take you very far. And then fourthly, we have the conclusion, which is quite simply the result of following the premises and often repeats the central claim. It doesn't always do it, and sometimes it changes the way it's worded, but in general, it tends to at least go back to the central claim or the thesis statement if you're looking at a larger report. So if you were to construct an extremely basic argument, we could say something along the lines of that our central claim is that schools should be shut down. So that's the answer to the question what. Like, okay, what are we saying? Well, we're saying that schools should shut down. And we have two reasons for this, so two premises for this, two things that answer the question why do we think so. Firstly, we claim that school makes students tired, and to build off of that, we also say that being tired makes you sad. And then to further substantiate our argument, we have a study that shows that being sad is a bad thing and shouldn't happen. And then our conclusion that is derived from these premises is that since school leads to people being sad, which has been proven to be bad, schools should simply be shut down. That's a very, 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 very basic way of approaching it. But it gives you the initial idea. We're going to move on and swap documents to this one. So we define an argument as a reason or set of reasons given in support of an idea, action, or theory. One more thing that we need to also know the definition of is a so-called thesis statement, because we're going to be looking at a full text later on which has a thesis statement in it. And a thesis statement is quite simply a short statement, usually one sentence long, that summarizes the main point or claim of an essay, research paper, and so on. Let me make a quick thing here, so we don't confuse that with the thesis statement. And also, as we just said, we went over the four main constituents of an argument: the initial claim, the reasons and the premises, the evidence, and the conclusion. Let's add the question what here, and as for the premises, that is the question they answer the question why. So to give you another example of an argument that is a tad more fleshed out before we get into the full text. Let's say that the initial claim is that parents should be given guaranteed parental leave upon the birth or introduction of a new child. That's our first initial claim. So that answers the question, what is it that we're actually thinking or arguing for? Our first premise, which answers the question why, is by giving them guaranteed parental leave, parents have more time to acclimate to their new role, responsibilities, and lifestyle, which can have a positive impact on their professional performance. So there we've given the first answer to the question, why do we think the way that we do? Secondly, we have the second premise where we also introduce a piece of evidence. There we say that additionally, in 2016, the National Library of Medicine published a study that found that companies that offered extended and paid parental leave experience lower employee turnover rates. So that's an additional answer to the question why. Which then leaves us with the conclusion. That's simply reads, as guaranteed parental leave results in improved professional performance and lowered turnover rates, it should be standard procedure in companies around the world. And there we have another example of a relatively basic but a bit more fleshed out version of the argument that we just went through, or went over. To put this now into a bit of a larger perspective, we are going to look at a full text that treats the concept of malaria and asks the question, should we work on preventing the disease altogether, or should we worry about treating infections as they have already happened? So now we're getting into a bit more advanced part of analyzing arguments, because now we have to look at a whole text. So I'm thinking we're going to do this in two ways, in two steps rather. Firstly, we are going to simply read through the text as it stands, the whole thing. It's not very long, it's about a page and a half. And then I have color-coded this same text to highlight the thesis statement, the arguments, the premises, the evidence, and the conclusion that the arguments reach. But let's start with simply reading through the text, and then I'll put timestamps in the video itself so you can skip to various parts if you don't want to hear me read through this thing. But let's start there. Malaria. Preventing or treating infection. Malaria is an infectious disease caused by parasites that are transmitted to people through the female Anopheles mosquitoes. I hope I pronounced that right. Each year, over 500 million people will become infected with malaria, with roughly 80% of them living in Sub-Saharan Africa. Nearly 500,000 people die of malaria every year, most of them young children under the age of 5. Unlike many other infectious diseases, the death toll for malaria is rising. While there have been many programs designed to improve access to malaria treatment, the best way to reduce the impact of malaria in Sub-Saharan Africa is to focus on reducing the number of people who contract the disease in the first place, rather than waiting to treat the disease after the person is already infected. There are multiple drugs available to treat malaria, and many of them work well and save lives, but malaria eradication programs that focuses too much on them and not enough on prevention haven't seen long-term success in Sub-Saharan Africa. A major program to combat malaria was the WHO's Global Malaria Eradication Program. Started in 1955, it had a goal of eliminating malaria in Africa within the next 10 years. Based upon previously successful programs in Brazil and the United States, the program focused mainly on vector control. This included widely distributing chloroquine and spraying large amounts of DDT. More than $1 billion was spent trying to abolish malaria. However, the program suffered from many problems, and in 1969, WHO was forced to admit that the program had not succeeded in eradicating malaria. The number of people in Sub-Saharan Africa who contracted malaria, as well as the number of malaria deaths, had actually increased over 10% during the time the program was active. One of the major reasons for the failure of the project was that it set uniform strategies and policies. By failing to consider variations between governments, geography, and infrastructure, the program was not nearly as successful as it could have been. Sub-Saharan Africa has neither the money nor the infrastructure to support such an elaborate program, and it couldn't be run the way it was meant to. Most African countries don't have the resources to send all their people to doctors and get shots, nor can they afford to clear wetlands or other malaria-prone areas. The continent's spending per person for eradicating malaria was just a quarter of what Brazil had spent. Sub-Saharan Africa simply can't rely on a plan that requires more money, infrastructure, and expertise than they have to spare. Additionally, the widespread use of chloroquine has created drug-resistant parasites which are now plaguing Sub-Saharan Africa. Because chloroquine was used widely, but inconsistently, mosquitoes developed resistance, and chloroquine is now nearly completely ineffective in Sub-Saharan Africa, with over 95% of mosquitoes resistant to it. As a result, newer and more expensive drugs need to be used to prevent and treat malaria, which further drives up the cost of malaria treatment for a region that can ill afford it. Instead of developing plans to treat malaria after the infection has occurred, programs should focus on preventing infection from occurring in the first place. Not only is this plan cheaper and more effective, but reducing the number of people who contract malaria also reduces loss of work and school days, which can further bring down the productivity of the region. One of the cheapest and most effective ways of preventing malaria is to implement insecticide-treated bed nets, ITNs. These nets provide a protective barrier around the person or people using them. While untreated bed nets are still helpful, those treated with insecticides are much more useful because they stop mosquitoes from biting people through the nets, and they help reduce mosquito populations in a community, thus helping people who don't even own bed nets. Bed nets are also very effective because most mosquito bites occur while the person is sleeping. So bed nets would be able to drastically reduce the number of transmissions during the night. In fact, transmission of malaria can be reduced by as much as 90% in areas where the use of ITNs is widespread. Because money is so scarce in Sub-Saharan Africa, the low cost is a great benefit and a major reason why the program is so successful. Bed nets cost roughly $2, so US dollars, to make. They last several years and can protect 2 adults. Studies have shown that for every 100 to 1,000 more nets are being used, 1 less child dies of malaria. With an estimated 300 million people in Africa not being protected by mosquito nets, there's the potential to save 3 million lives by spending just a few dollars per person. Reducing the number of people who contract malaria would also reduce poverty levels in Africa significantly, thus improving other aspects of society like education levels and the economy. Vector control is more effective than treatment strategies because it means fewer people are going to get sick. When fewer people get sick, the working population is stronger as a whole because people are not put out of work from malaria, nor are they caring for sick relatives. Malaria-afflicted families can typically only harvest 40% of the crops that healthy families can harvest. Furthermore, a family with members who have malaria spends roughly a quarter of its income treatment, not including the loss of work they must also deal with due to the illness. It's estimated that malaria costs Africa $12 billion in lost income every year. A strong working population creates a stronger economy, which Sub-Saharan Africa is in desperate need of. So that's the text. If we scroll down further, and for all my students, this is going to be uploaded to your various classrooms as well, so you can access this to look at it again in your own time, if you wish. So like I said, I color-coded this thing, and I'm going to go through it briefly, so you can look at it yourself if you wish. Green will highlight the thesis statement, of which there will only be one, naturally. Yellow will show central and initial claims. Purple shows premises and evidence. And teal highlights conclusions. So the very first paragraph here, which you more than likely know by now, I sincerely hope, is the introduction, which simply provides background information and introduces both stances. And at the end here, highlighted in green, we have the thesis statement. In particular here, because the first dependent clause here simply say that there are programs designed to improve the access to the treatment. The best way is actually to try to reduce the initial infection altogether. So here you find the main thesis statement, the main claim of the whole paper. Their first argument then comes right after that, which is basically that not focusing enough on eradication of initial infection causes far more problems than it solves. So you can't play both sides. Either you have to go super hard on sending out treatment, or you try to eradicate initial infection as much as humanly possible. So the first initial claim here is that there are multiple drugs available to treat malaria, and many of them work well and save lives. So it gives credence to the drugs and saying that they do exist and they are good. But the malaria eradication programs that they have seen thus far focus too much on them and not enough on prevention, which has negative long-term consequences. So here's the what question, or rather the answer to the what question. Why do we think the way that we do? Or what do we think? What do we think? Which is followed right by the main premise here. That could be broken down into multiple premises, but I'm keeping it simple and compacting it to one. And then they proceed to answer the question, why do we think the way that we do? And they simply show that using statistics and using studies that with this plan that tried to play both sides, i.e. treat and eradicate the disease, actually sort of backfired by actually increasing the amount of malaria deaths and the people who actually contracted malaria in the first place. That's because they fail to consider the various differences between other countries to which they compare themselves and thought, well, these people or these countries did this, thus it should work over here too. And they didn't realize that the countries were so different, especially the amount of money that could be spent. And at the very bottom of this paragraph, you have the sort of conclusion of this argument that says, the continent's spending per person for eradicating malaria, which is a quarter of what Brazil spent. So basically, because of all of this, Sub-Saharan Africa simply can't rely on a plan that requires more money, infrastructure, and expertise than they have to spare. So this is sort of a counter-argument to their own, or rather, they somewhat introduce, here's just what not to do. And then you could argue that their second argument directly expands on their first argument, which just shows, you could technically say that this is just a further premise to the first argument, which simply states that due to the chloroquine that they discussed up here in the first argument, caused major issues because 95% of mosquitoes are now resistant to this treatment, and and as a result, now newer and more expensive drugs need to be created, which is another huge financial toll on the Sub-Saharan African countries and their societies. So this thing only created more problems, far more than it actually solved. And their third argument is one that actually connects straight back to their thesis statement and starts offering sort of solutions, which is to focus 100% on prevention of initial infection. So their central claim there is, instead of developing plans to treat malaria after the infection has occurred, programs should focus on preventing infection from occurring in the first place. Here is their initial claim, what they think, And here is just an extremely quick summary of their arguments, which is that firstly, it's more effective, it's cheaper, and it's more effective. It reduces the number of people who contract malaria, while also reduces loss of work school days, which further helps the region, basically. And they move on to then explain what they mean by it being cheaper and more effective. And again, like we just read, they state that they can implement insecticide-treated bed nets, which is extremely cheap, but also extremely effective. And that would then help 300 million people, basically. By spending a few dollars per person, you could save 3 million lives. That's sort of the conclusion of their first argument here. Secondly, they have their fourth argument, you could say, depending on how you want to view it. I've just broken it down now as much as I could for simplicity's sake. But the fourth argument then continues to discuss the fact that by reducing initial infection, poverty levels will also be reduced, which is another good thing for the economy. And their initial claim here is that reducing the number of people who contract malaria would also, so going back up to this first argument, reduce poverty levels in Africa significantly, thus improving other aspects of society like education levels and the economy. So again, what? And then they reply with why, and then the conclusion of this argument. And that's the end of that text, and that would also mark the end of the video. Basically, when you're analyzing arguments and when you're writing ones on your own, if I were to leave you with a final piece of advice, keep it very simple and simply make sure that you have, well, if you're writing a full text, make sure you have a very clear thesis statement, because all of your arguments will link back to this thesis statement. For your arguments themselves, make sure you have a strong initial claim. So what is it that you're actually arguing? What's your main claim that would back up the thesis statement? Make sure you have reasons and premises for your argument. In other words, answer why do you think that way? And then, of course, always provide evidence by use of secondary sources or primary sources if possible to further substantiate the argument and its validity. So in this text, for instance, they reference back to the global malaria eradication program, what happened. They even include some statistics on how it went the wrong way and was actually counterproductive. And then when they start to introduce their own sort of positive claims, they include further statistics and how much things cost and how many lives would be saved and so on and so on. And that's that for the first video on the deconstruction of an argument. I hope that it somewhat helped you, and if there are any questions, shoot me an email and we'll get right to it, or just look me up in school. And best of luck with your argumentative texts, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for tuning in. Wow, thanks for tuning in.